His hands never shook when working under the hood, even on the most delicate engine repairs. Neighbors joked that 72-year-old mechanic Frank Rodriguez had steadier hands than surgeons. They didn't know that those same hands had once defused improvised explosive devices in Iraq and Afghanistan, where a single tremor could mean the difference between saving lives and becoming a statistic. Until the day a car bomb threatened City Hall and Frank's bomb disposal training returned like muscle memory. Welcome to Hidden Legends. Before we begin this intense story of a mechanic whose steady hands once saved lives in the world's most dangerous places, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe that true heroes often work with grease under their fingernails, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve in unexpected ways. Frank Rodriguez opened Rodriguez Auto Repair every morning at 7 a.m. sharp. At 72, he moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes could be costly. His small garage sat on the corner of Main Street and 3rd Avenue in the town of Cedar Falls, where he had been fixing cars for the past 20 years. Frank's customers trusted him completely, not just because he charged fair prices or because he never tried to sell unnecessary repairs, but because of something harder to define. There was a precision to everything Frank did, a methodical approach that made even the most complex engine problems seem manageable. "Mr. Rodriguez," said Janet Miller, watching Frank diagnose her car's transmission, "your hands are so steady. Have you ever considered being a surgeon?" Frank smiled while carefully adjusting a wrench. "These old hands are better suited for engines, Mrs. Miller. Less pressure." What Janet didn't know was that Frank's hands had once worked under the ultimate pressure. For 15 years, as a Navy Explosive Ordnance Disposal specialist, those same steady fingers had defused over 1,200 explosive devices. Every movement had been a matter of life and death. Young Tommy Chen, who worked part-time at the garage after school, was fascinated by Frank's precision. "Mr. Rodriguez, you never seem nervous, even with the really complicated repairs. Like, when Mr. Patterson's engine was making that weird noise, you just listened and knew exactly what was wrong." Frank nodded, continuing his work on the carburetor. "Experience, Tommy. When you've worked with your hands long enough, you learn to trust what they tell you." Tommy didn't understand that Frank's experience included defusing roadside bombs where the wrong move would kill not just him, but the soldiers depending on him. Frank had learned to read the subtle vibrations of unstable explosives to distinguish between the tick of a timer and the hum of a harmless mechanism. Dr. Sarah Kim, who brought her Honda to Frank every few months, had noticed something unusual about his workspace. Everything was organized with military precision. Tools were arranged in specific patterns. Parts were labeled and stored in exact locations. Even his movements followed a systematic approach that seemed almost ritualistic. "Frank, your organization is incredible," Dr. Kim observed. "It's like you're following a specific protocol for everything." "Habits die hard," Frank replied, not looking up from the engine. "Some things are too important to leave to chance." Dr. Kim, who worked as a trauma surgeon at the county hospital, recognized something in Frank's methodical approach. It was the same careful precision she used when operating on critical patients, where every movement had to be perfect. What Dr. Kim didn't know was that Frank's habits had been forged in combat zones where improvised explosive devices killed or maimed American soldiers daily. His protocols weren't just about fixing cars, they were about staying alive and keeping others alive. Frank had retired from the Navy in 2003 after his final deployment to Afghanistan. He had seen enough death, defused enough bombs, and lost enough friends to explosive devices. He chose auto repair specifically because it was peaceful, predictable work where the worst-case scenario was an expensive repair bill, not a body bag. But some training never fades, and some instincts, once developed under life-and-death conditions, never completely disappear. On a Tuesday morning in September, Frank noticed something that made his trained instincts activate. A suspicious van had been parked across from the courthouse for 3 days. The driver changed daily, but the vehicle remained in the same spot, always with someone inside who seemed to be observing the building. Frank's bomb disposal training had taught him to recognize surveillance patterns. The timing, the positioning, the behavior of the occupants all indicated reconnaissance for a potential target. "Tommy," Frank said quietly, "take a look at that van across the street. Tell me what you notice." Tommy glanced over. "Just a van, Mr. Rodriguez. Why?" "Look at the license plate. Look at where it's positioned. Notice how the person inside has been there for 40 minutes but hasn't gotten out." Tommy looked more carefully. "That is weird. Should we call the police?" Frank continued working on the engine in front of him, but his mind was cataloging details. The van provided clear sight lines to both the courthouse entrance and the parking garage. The occupant had been taking photos with a long lens camera. Most telling, the vehicle had been moved slightly each day to different vantage points around the same target. "Not yet, Tommy, but keep watching." That afternoon, Frank walked to Murphy's Diner across from the courthouse for his usual coffee. From the window, he could observe the van more closely. The current occupant was a middle-aged man with military-style haircut and tactical clothing. He was photographing the courthouse systematically, documenting security camera positions and guard patrol patterns. Frank's EOD experience had taught him that surveillance was the first phase of most bombing operations. Terrorists needed to understand their target's vulnerabilities, security measures, and daily routines before planning an attack. When Frank returned to his garage, he made a decision. He called Detective Mike Walsh, a longtime customer whose patrol car Frank had serviced many times. "Mike, it's Frank Rodriguez. I need to report some suspicious activity near the courthouse." Detective Walsh took Frank's observations seriously. Frank had a reputation for being observant and level-headed, but when Walsh ran the van's license plate, it came back clean. When officers approached the vehicle, the occupant produced valid identification and claimed to be a freelance photographer documenting historic buildings. "False alarm, Frank," Walsh reported back. "Just a photographer working on some kind of architectural project." But Frank's instincts disagreed. 15 years of identifying potential explosive threats had taught him to trust his gut over official explanations. Something about the surveillance pattern felt deliberate and hostile. 2 days later, Frank's concerns were validated when he noticed the van had been replaced by a sedan, but the surveillance continued. Different vehicle, different driver, same target, same methodical documentation. Frank realized he was observing the preliminary stages of what could be a major terrorist operation. Friday morning started normally until Deputy Sheriff Lisa Chen rushed into Frank's garage, her face pale with urgency. "Frank, we need to evacuate this entire block, now." Frank looked up from the transmission he was rebuilding. "What's the situation, Lisa?" "Bomb threat. Someone called in a device planted somewhere in this area. We're evacuating everyone within a 3-block radius of the courthouse." Frank's blood chilled. His surveillance observations over the past week suddenly made sense. The reconnaissance had been preparation for exactly this scenario. "Any specifics about the device?" Frank asked, his voice carrying a professional tone that surprised Lisa. "Not much. Anonymous caller said it was in a vehicle, set to detonate during the lunch hour when the courthouse would be busiest." Frank glanced at his watch. 11:47 a.m. Lunch hour started at noon. As Lisa helped evacuate the area, Frank found himself scanning the parking areas around the courthouse with trained eyes. His EOD experience had taught him to identify vehicles that looked wrong, cars that sat too low, had unusual modifications, or showed signs of having been tampered with. That's when he spotted it. A blue sedan parked in the courthouse visitor lot. The same sedan that had been conducting surveillance earlier in the week. But now something was different. The car sat lower than normal, indicating heavy weight in the trunk. Unusual wiring was visible under the dashboard. Most telling, the vehicle had been positioned for maximum damage to the courthouse entrance. Frank approached Detective Walsh, who was coordinating the evacuation. "Mike, I think I found your device." Walsh looked where Frank was pointing. "That sedan." "How can you tell?" "Vehicle positioning for maximum blast effect, unusual weight distribution, visible wiring modifications, and I've been watching that car conduct surveillance on this building all week." Walsh stared at Frank. "Frank, How do you know about blast patterns and surveillance techniques? Frank realized his cover was about to be blown, but lives were at stake. Because I spent 15 years defusing bombs for the Navy. Detective Walsh stared at Frank Rodriguez, the quiet mechanic who had just identified a potential car bomb and revealed military explosive ordnance disposal experience. Frank, are you serious about this? You were Navy EOD? Frank nodded, his eyes still focused on the suspicious sedan. Petty Officer First Class Frank Rodriguez, Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit. Deployed to Iraq 3 times, Afghanistan twice. Defused 1,247 improvised explosive devices during my 15-year career. Tommy, who had been listening from behind a police cruiser, couldn't believe what he was hearing. Mr. Rodriguez, you were a bomb disposal expert? I was, retired in 2003. Came here because I wanted to fix engines instead of defusing explosives. Detective Walsh was processing this information while coordinating with the bomb squad by radio. Frank, our EOD team is 40 minutes out. The device could detonate any time before then. Frank looked at the courthouse where a few stragglers were still being evacuated. He thought about the courthouse staff he knew, the people who worked there daily, the families who might be visiting. Mike, I need to take a look at that device. Frank, you're a civilian now. I can't authorize that. And I'm the only person within 50 miles who has the training to assess what we're dealing with. Dr. Kim, who had been evacuated from the medical clinic nearby, overheard the conversation. Detective Walsh, I've watched Frank work for years. His precision is incredible. If he says he can help, you should listen. Frank walked toward the blue sedan, his training automatically taking over. He moved with the same methodical precision he used when diagnosing engine problems, but now every step was calculated to avoid triggering any motion sensors. As he approached the vehicle, Frank could see confirmation of his assessment. The trunk sat low from heavy weight. Wiring ran from the dashboard toward the back of the car. Most concerning, he could hear a faint electronic humming that indicated an active timing device. Frank knelt beside the car and listened carefully. His trained ear could distinguish between different types of timing mechanisms, identify the power source, and estimate the payload size based on the electronic signature. It's active, he called back to Detective Walsh. Soviet-era timer mechanism, probably connected to about 50 pounds of commercial explosives. Based on the humming frequency, I'd estimate less than 10 minutes remaining. Detective Walsh felt his stomach drop. Frank, can you stop it? Frank looked under the dashboard and identified the trigger mechanism. It was a design he had encountered dozens of times in Iraq, a pressure-sensitive switch combined with a timer backup, sophisticated enough to kill effectively, but simple enough that someone with his experience could defeat it. Yes, but I need everyone to stay back. If this goes wrong, the blast radius will be about 200 yards. For the first time in 20 years, Frank Rodriguez was about to become a bomb disposal expert again. Frank's hands moved with the same steady precision his customers had observed for 20 years, but now he was working with wires and timers instead of spark plugs and carburettors. His fingers felt for the familiar components of an improvised explosive device: power source, timer, trigger mechanism, payload. Talk to me, Frank, Detective Walsh called from behind the safety perimeter. What are you seeing? Standard IED configuration, Frank replied, his voice calm despite the circumstances. 2-part trigger system, primary timer counting down, secondary pressure switches backup, designed to detonate if moved or if the timer reaches 0. Frank traced the wiring with his eyes, identifying the circuit pathways. This was exactly the type of device he had encountered in Fallujah, Kandahar, and countless other combat zones. The makers had used techniques he recognized from terrorist training manuals. How much time? Walsh asked. Frank could hear the timer mechanism clearly now. Based on the pulse frequency, approximately 6 minutes. Frank opened his pocket toolkit, the same precise instruments he used for automotive work, but which had originally been selected for explosive ordnance disposal. His hands moved without hesitation, muscle memory guiding him through procedures he had performed over 1,000 times. First step, isolate the power source, Frank murmured, more to himself than to his audience. He identified the battery connection and carefully traced it to the timing circuit. Frank could feel his old training taking over completely, the same calm focus that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments, the same methodical approach that had saved countless military and civilian lives. "Tommy," Frank called back to his young assistant, "remember what I always tell you about working with delicate mechanisms? Steady hands, clear mind, and trust your training," Tommy replied, his voice shaky. "Exactly. Same principles apply here." Frank located the primary circuit connection. In his experience, devices like this typically had a single critical junction point. Interrupt the circuit at the right location, and the device would be safely disabled. Cut the wrong wire, and the backup trigger would immediately detonate the explosives. "Frank," Dr. Kim called out, "how are you so calm right now?" Frank smiled grimly while examining the wire configuration. "Doctor, this is just another precision repair job. Higher stakes, but same principles." With 4 minutes remaining, Frank identified the correct wire sequence. Red wire for timer, blue wire for backup trigger, green wire for main power. The standard configuration he had memorized 15 years ago. Frank positioned his wire cutters with surgical precision. "When I cut this wire, the device will be disabled. Everyone stay in position until I confirm it's safe." His hands moved with the same steadiness that had impressed customers for 20 years. No tremor, no hesitation, no doubt. Frank cut the green wire. The electronic humming stopped immediately. The timer display went dark. After a moment of silence, Frank carefully examined the remaining components to confirm the device was completely inert. "Device disabled," Frank announced. "All clear." Within hours, Frank's actions had been reported to federal authorities. FBI explosive experts arrived to examine the disabled device and confirmed that Frank had successfully neutralized a sophisticated car bomb that would have killed dozens of people and destroyed a significant portion of the courthouse. Agent Maria Santos approached Frank as he was cleaning the grease from his hands, the same methodical cleaning routine he followed after any repair job. "Mr. Rodriguez, I need to thank you on behalf of the Bureau. What you did today saved lives and prevented a major terrorist attack." Frank nodded politely. "Just applied old training to a new situation, Agent Santos. Your military record shows 15 years of exemplary service in explosive ordnance disposal. Why didn't you ever mention this background to local law enforcement?" Frank looked around at his garage, at Tommy, who was still processing what had happened, at the community he had served quietly for 20 years. "Because I came here to fix cars, not fight wars. I wanted a peaceful life where the most dangerous thing I handled was a leaky radiator." Detective Walsh approached with newfound respect. "Frank, I've been bringing my car to you for 10 years. I had no idea you had this background." "That's how I wanted it, Mike. I've been Frank the mechanic for 20 years. Today I had to be Frank the bomb disposal expert. Tomorrow I'll go back to being Frank the mechanic." Tommy finally found his voice. "Mr. Rodriguez, all those times you taught me about precision, about steady hands, about following procedures, you were teaching me what kept you alive in the military." Frank smiled and put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Good habits serve you well in any profession, son. Whether you're rebuilding an engine or defusing a bomb, attention to detail saves lives." Dr. Kim, who had watched the entire event unfold, approached Frank with a new understanding. "Your organizational system, your methodical approach to every repair, it all makes sense now." "Some habits you never lose," Frank replied. "They just find new applications." The mayor arrived with local news crews, but Frank politely declined interviews. He simply wanted to return to his garage and continue the work he'd been doing for 20 years. But word spread quickly through Cedar Falls. The quiet mechanic who had fixed their cars with steady hands and fair prices had once saved soldiers' lives in combat zones around the world, and when his community needed those skills again, he had stepped forward without hesitation. The next morning, Frank opened his garage at 7 a.m. sharp, just as he had every day for 20 years. But now his customers looked at him differently, not with fear or awe, but with deeper respect for the man who had served his country in war and continued serving his community in peace. Tommy arrived early, eager to learn more about precision and attention to detail from someone who had applied those principles in the highest stakes situations imaginable. "Mr. Rodriguez," Tommy said, "will you teach me about both kinds of repair work, car engines and the other kind?" Frank smiled while organizing his tools with the same methodical precision that had characterized his entire career, both military and civilian. "Tommy, the principles are the same: steady hands, clear mind, and respect for the tools that can either create or destroy. Whether you're fixing someone's car or saving their life, precision matters." Frank Rodriguez continued fixing cars in Cedar Falls, but now everyone understood that his steady hands carried the weight of both professional expertise and personal sacrifice. He had found peace in precision work, whether defusing bombs or rebuilding engines. Some skills transfer perfectly from battlefield to garage, and sometimes the quietest heroes are the ones whose steady hands have seen both war and peace and chosen to build rather than destroy.